Hi, and welcome back to Grade 8 Math. This is Section 1, Lesson 1, and the third and final video for this lesson. This is Ms. Clemens-Brenton, and in this video, we will look at how to choose an appropriate graph for a data set. Example 1. The two graphs show the number of donuts sold in one day. On the top here, we have a pictograph, and on the bottom, we have a bar graph. List two things you know from the pictograph. Well, there are a number of different things that you can identify by looking at this pictograph. One thing that I see is that the most popular donut is vanilla sprinkles. You can see that vanilla sprinkles and Boston cream are pretty close, but the vanilla sprinkles, the last donut is a half and the Boston cream is a quarter. So obviously vanilla sprinkles is more. We have 36 orange glazed donuts that were sold. So I can see that straight from my graph here. Each donut is worth 12, and 12 times 3 gives me 36. List two things you know from the bar graph. Well, in looking at the bar graph, I can see that there were exactly 60 strawberry-filled donuts sold. I can also see that there were exactly 75 Boston cream donuts sold. Again, there are a number of different things that you could list. I could say that orange glaze sold the least amount. I could say vanilla sprinkles sold the most. But it's difficult in some cases to identify exactly how many donuts in a particular category. One advantage and one disadvantage of each graph. Well, for the pictograph, it's very visually appealing. That one really catches my eye. All the different donuts that are there makes it very pretty to look at, the different colors, and it's fairly easy to read. But one disadvantage is that we have to actually tally up the total. So in order to figure out the number of donuts sold in a particular category, I have to look at each donut, say each donut is equal to 12, and then I would have to multiply and add on, the partial donuts. So for example, vanilla sprinkles, I can see that we have 6 full donuts. So 6 times 12, that gives me 72. And then I have half of a donut, so I have to add on another 6, so that would give me 78. For the bar graph, an advantage is that we can easily compare categories. So when I look at that bar graph, I can see that vanilla sprinkles is the most, orange glaze is the least. I can see which is the second highest category, the second lowest category, and so on. But it's hard to read some of the categories in this particular case. So looking at the scale and then looking where the lines fall on that graph and where the bars actually cross the grid lines, it is kind of difficult to determine exactly how many of each type of donut are sold in certain cases. Which graph is more appropriate to display the data? Either graph is a good choice for discrete data, which is what we're talking about here, but it really depends on the goal. I believe that the first graph is more visually appealing with the different types of donuts. It is easy to compare the categories. If I was looking to display the numbers in each category, or I wanted someone to be able to figure those out pretty quickly, then I may want to use a bar graph instead. But I think the pictograph definitely serves its purpose here. Would you use a line graph or a circle graph to display the data? Well, we could use a circle graph if we wanted to show percents. It's also a good choice when we're talking about the number of donuts that are sold in comparison to the whole. So looking at each sector on a circle graph, we could definitely tell which donuts sold the most and which sold the least, and so on. So it would be a good choice. A line graph would not be appropriate since this is discrete data. Line graphs only display continuous data. Example 2. The two graphs show the scores on a recent math test. So on the top here we have a line graph, and on the bottom we have a bar graph. List one thing you know from the line graph. Well, again, there are multiple things that you could determine by looking at that line graph, and answers will vary. When I look at that line graph, I see that Ahmed and James had the high scores. They're very close. It looks like James was a little bit higher than Ahmed, but they definitely were the two highest scores in the class. List one thing you know from the bar graph. Well, one thing that I see when I look at the bar graph is that Mika received 80%. I could also say that James was the highest. I could say Ashton was the lowest. I could say that Saeed scored somewhere around an 85, and so on. So there are various answers for that question. List one advantage and one disadvantage of each graph. So for the line graph, an advantage is that we can see who had the highest or the lowest scores. So that's easily determined from that line graph. But a disadvantage is that it's not very visually appealing. My eyes are not drawn to that graph, unlike the bar graph where I see all the different colors. I like the look of the bar graph more, definitely in this case. One advantage and one disadvantage of a bar graph? Well, an advantage is that it's easier to compare scores. So I can compare the scores between the students. I can see who had the highest, who had the lowest, what two scores were close, and so on. A disadvantage, though, is that it's difficult to read the exact scores for some students in this case. So again, looking at the scale and looking where the bars fall, it is kind of difficult to read the exact scores for some students. So like Mary, I don't know if Mary had 77 or 78 and so on. Unless they fall exactly on the line on the grid, it may be difficult to determine what the score was. Which graph is more appropriate to display the data and why? The bar graph is definitely more appropriate since we're discussing discrete data. A line graph is not a suitable graph for this sort of data because line graphs are for continuous data only. So a line graph is definitely not the appropriate graph to choose in this case. Example 3. Data is collected for each situation below. What type of graph would be best to display the data in each set and why? Well, the first example, the growth of a fir tree over 15 years. The best graph to display that data would be a line graph because we're talking about continuous data. Continuous data is something that can be measured at any point in time. We're talking about the growth of the fir tree over time. So that would definitely be a line graph. For B, prices of different brands of athletic shoes. A good graph for that would be a bar graph. We're talking about different brands. We want to compare the prices of different brands. So a bar graph would be a good choice to display that data. We are talking about discrete data. The preferred extracurricular activities of grade 8 and 9 students. Well, a good choice for that one would be a double bar graph. We're comparing grade 8s to grade 9s. So if we're showing multiple activities and we want to show the number of grade 8s versus the number of grade 9s who chose each activity, a double bar graph would allow us to compare side by side the grade 8s to the grade 9s. We are also talking about discrete data, so we would not use a line graph in this case. A bar graph would be the best choice. The percentage of votes each candidate received in the student council election. Well, if we're talking about percentages, the best graph to choose would be a circle graph. Circle graphs are always the graph to choose if we want to show percents, and we are talking about discrete data. The number of pets on your street. A bar graph or a pictograph will be a good choice for this one. We are talking about discrete data, so we definitely would not choose a line graph. I would probably choose a pictograph because we could use a nice little picture of some sort of a pet to display that and make it visually appealing. But a bar graph would definitely serve the purpose in this case, and it would make it easy to compare categories. And for F, the length of time that it takes to drain the bathtub, well, this would also be a line graph. We are talking about continuous data. We are talking about measuring the height of the water over time. So the line graph would definitely be the best choice of graph in this case. Please complete the activities for this lesson.